So tonight we're just going to look at a couple of verses, and this is Matthew 7, 13 through 14 will be our verses tonight. Now, if you see the top of your handout, it says 2 ways. Actually, the rest of Matthew 7 that we're going to be studying is dealing with two ways, kind of. We'll talk about 2 paths tonight, or 2 gates, and then we'll talk about 2 kinds of fruit. Good and bad, and then we'll talk about 2 judgments, those who will enter the kingdom and those who will not, and then 2 foundations. And so those are the kinds of lessons that Jesus will conclude the Sermon on the Mount with. But tonight it's really just letter A there, the broad and the narrow gate. That's verses 13 and 14. By way of introduction again, just to get us back on the same page, this is the first recorded sermon in the book of Matthew, an extended discussion here. We call it the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is being portrayed by Matthew here as kind of the new lawgiver, the new Moses, so to speak. And he is going up on the mountain like Moses went up on the mountain to receive the law, but he's going up on the mountain, and as the new Moses, he's now disseminating the truth of God. This is now going to be for the kingdom of heaven, not the kingdom of Israel per se, but the kingdom of heaven. And he gives a lot of very practical and very important teachings in the sermon here on the mountain as the new Moses, opening up the kingdom now. So we've kind of set the stage for this whole sermon by saying that, the kingdom is a reality. Jesus came to establish it, and he began to establish it even in his ministry. And those who heeded him as the new king, the new lawgiver and all that, they entered into the kingdom. Though, of course, during his personal ministry, it was still in a stage of preparation, we sometimes say. It became a reality in practice in Acts 2 with the establishment of the church. And yet, even today, we still await a future consummation, we say, the eternal or everlasting kingdom that Peter mentions in 1 Peter chapter 1, right? An entrance will be supplied unto you, Christians, in the everlasting kingdom. So in that sense, the kingdom is kind of an eternal idea in the Bible, and we live now in the stage in which has been established since Acts 2. And we live in between the times, so to speak. We live in a state of forgiveness since the death, burial, and resurrection and the preaching of the gospel, and we've obeyed it, but we still await a future consummation of it. And so in that sense, when you read the Sermon on the Mount, you want to see that we can read it as members or as a reality and as a present reality in our lives. Like chapter 6, verse 33 says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." And of course, we take that promise, thankfully, as a promise even for the present time. So we live in the kingdom of God even today. So that's where I think leading up to this verse we're looking at, chapter 7, verse 13, when Jesus says, "Enter by the narrow gate," he's saying you can come into the kingdom. You can enter the kingdom, of course, but you must enter the kingdom by what he's here calling a narrow gate. We'll talk more about how this metaphor plays out. The gate that opens into a path, a way that you need to walk in order to arrive at the ultimate destination. That's the way I understand these verses to be teaching. But anyway, here's how the outline begins. Letter A, these verses talk about a broad gate and a narrow gate. And I think just in most general terms, I would say this. Jesus is simply giving us the difference between real discipleship and nominal or fake or discipleship only in name, where you just say that you're a disciple, but you're not really living as one. Does that make sense? And so that's what I mean by real and nominal discipleship. And of course, God is not going to accept somebody who just claims to be a disciple. Remember, a few verses later, he's going to say, many people will say to me in the day of judgment, Lord, Lord. But that doesn't mean that he was really their Lord. The only way that he's really their Lord is if they submit to his lordship and worship him as their Lord. That means obedience, right? Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is the one who would be considered the real disciple, but these were just nominal disciples. They would use the name, but they were not real. I think the basic idea of this whole teaching is much like what you see in various places in the Old Testament. I have here Deuteronomy 30, and you could even start back at verse 15 through 19. But you remember when Moses himself said, behold, I put before you life and death. Right? I put before you a way of life and a way of death. Let's look at that. Deuteronomy chapter 30, even going back to verse 15, he says, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil, in that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, his judgments, so that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you go to possess. Of course, verse 17, if your heart turns away and you don't hear, and you're drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, then I announce that you will surely perish. But as I have marked out here, look at verse 19. I call heaven and earth as witness today against you, that as I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life. So I think this is essentially what Jesus is doing now with regard to his kingdom. He's the new Moses, and he's setting before us the same idea here. And just like he's using covenantal terms in the days of Moses here, when he says, I call heaven and earth as witness today against you, that's covenant terminology. Heaven and earth would be witness to the oath of the covenant that you're taking here. So what are you going to do, basically, is what Moses is saying. You got to make a choice. Are you going to choose life or choose death? Well, that's what, again, I think that's a good background with which to read Matthew 7, 13 and 14. And so Jesus simply is saying the same thing. It's a decision. It's something you have to determine in your heart and mind. It's basically the call of the gospel, isn't it? Repent ye and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus for the remission of sins. I mean, that was the way it was first opened up in Acts 2:38. And so Jesus really is just, in his ministry, he's basically saying the same thing. I want you to enter the kingdom. So you're either in the kingdom or you're not. And so Jesus here is saying, okay, here's how. You've got to enter it by the narrow gate. So he will begin to talk a little bit about the narrow gate in a moment. But first he says, in verse 13, he says, enter by the narrow gate, because wide is the gate and broad is the path or the way that leads to destruction. So that's why he's saying enter the narrow gate. Don't enter the wide gate, because I don't want you to be destroyed. So I want you to enter the narrow gate. And he says this wide way, he says many go in by that way. Okay? And then he goes on to say in verse 14, and when he says because here, I see the idea here is, if that's the proper word, there's some textual differences there, but either way, it seems that Jesus is saying, okay, many people are on the wide way. Why? Well, because the narrow way is constricted. It's more difficult. It's, as we'll talk about here, it's a lot more difficult even to identify. Okay? And so the narrow gate is difficult, he says. Look at verse 14. Narrow is the gate and difficult. You might have a different word there. I have it in the footnote, confined. Confined is the way. If you have King James, I think it says straight. Is that S-T-R-A-I-T? See, we think of straight, S-T-R-A-I-G-H-T, and that means straight as a string. But that's not the word that's being used here. He's not talking about how straight it is as far as geometry is concerned. He's talking about how constricted or how narrow. Yeah, you could talk about the Straits of Gibraltar or something like that, where ships have to navigate through this little narrow way, and if they get off course, they're going to have a shipwreck, right? And so that's the word strait in the King James, but I know in English we have a word that sounds, it's pronounced the same way, but it doesn't mean the same thing. That's why in my New King James it says difficult. It just means difficult to navigate, because there are lots of directions that you need to heed in order to stay on it. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's what he says there. But that's the way that leads to life. And interestingly, and shockingly perhaps, he says there are few who find it. So that's pretty sobering. In fact, as he gets into the paragraphs ahead, as we mentioned, like verse 21 and verse 22, many will claim to be Christians, but they're really not in obedience to God. And so that's the importance of what he's saying here. So the rest of the outline here is just the way I've chosen to treat these two verses. I say here important considerations, and I've used P as the what's the word you call it? Alliteration. That was right on the tip of my tongue. So purposefulness, popularity, persistence, and predestination. I had to have a P word at the end, so I used predestination. We'll explain that in just a minute. But anyway, so I think these are some lessons to think about. First of all, does everybody see the wording Jesus is using in these verses and the basic idea? But there are some interesting nuances, I think, that we'll talk about. Yeah, Carter.
I've actually been thinking about these two verses a lot in my own studies. And I was reading a book about, just like modern culture and all this kind of stuff. And in the book, and like when I was studying, it was talking about how this passage, for example, that as true disciples of Christ, true Christians, the biggest difference that true Christianity makes from the other religions in the world is that it goes completely against the fallenness of human nature. So, and so, many people will claim, hey, I'm Christian, I go to so-and-so Baptist church, I go to so-and-so other church over here, but they fall to human nature and they form their truth around human nature. So that they try to satisfy those needs while also using the lens of the Bible. But true Christianity and true discipleship takes the Bible and forms their life around that.
Very good.
And oftentimes that goes against human nature, and that's why you know that it's the one true way. Because
right.
Any other religion will try to find a way to let you basically do what you want to do as a human. But Christianity is like, no, what you want to do as a human leads you to death.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Here, that wide gate leads to destruction, but the narrow gate,
yeah.
you go by.
It's interesting as you were explaining that, which I totally agree. I think that's great. Is it Proverbs 14:12? There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end of that way is the way of death. That's going to be a good backdrop for what Jesus is saying here, and what Carter was explaining as well, that some of the things in the Bible seem counterintuitive just at first glance, because we're so used to the course of the world, the way the world thinks. We would think more money is better, more popularity is better, more friends is better, just those kinds of shallow sentiments. And if we're just surrounded by that, and that's kind of our mindset, Bible truths will seem counterintuitive, and it will seem like, well, that's not the way. But like Carter's saying, true Christians are going to say, God, you tell me what the way is, and then I'm going to strive to conform my categories and concepts in harmony with your word. And that's narrow, so to speak. That's where God's saying, okay, you can't just make up your own truth or believe whatever you want to believe. You've got to stay within the confines of what I have revealed, because that is what Christianity is all about. That's what being in the kingdom and being a child of God is all about. So excellent thoughts, and we will have a little bit of time to elaborate on some of those details even further in a moment, but great thoughts. I appreciate that. So the first thing I mentioned here is purposefulness, and what I mean by that is that I think what Jesus means is you don't accidentally stumble into the narrow way. It doesn't work that way. You got to purposefully seek for it and find it. He even uses the word find. Now in verse 13, when he talks about the wide way, he says many go in by it. So there is more like you stumble into that, right? But he says at the end of verse 14, few find the narrow way, because you got to find it. You got to be looking and finding it. I think those are important nuances. I mean, obviously Jesus didn't elaborate on those nuances, but I think they're implied, which is why I've got them here in the notes. And I have here the broad gate / Broadway is accommodating to the many. It has a room for anybody and all kinds of opinions and all kinds of thoughts and philosophies, and everybody can be going in the same direction when they go on this way, even though they have different ideas or beliefs perhaps. But the point is that the one direction they're going is destruction. It's not the way to life. And so the broad gate of the Broadway is accommodating to the many. It's easily found. It's well marked out. You can find it at every turn, so to speak. But the narrow gate, the narrow way, is less obvious for the reasons we just described with Carter's comment. It's recognized only by those who seek diligently for it. You have passages like Hebrews 11:6, right? Without faith it is impossible to please God, but he who comes to God must believe that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. You know, that's the kind of idea. Paul told the philosophers in Acts 17, he's not far from any one of us, but he has put you where you are to seek him and grope for him. So the idea is effort, and you have to be determined. And that's what God wants. He wants an honest, searching heart, and he will be found. Jeremiah 29:11. I'll be found by those who seek for me with all of their heart. So it's not going to be enough just to be half-hearted or lukewarm. And there's plenty of scriptures that teach that as well. And so that's the idea of purposefulness. One doesn't accidentally find and walk the narrow way. He must determine to walk faithfully. And then, of course, this is a more obvious nuance or teaching of this passage, is number 2, popularity. Popularity is not a test of truth. It's not a test of virtue. You don't learn truth by taking a count of a vote, by a count of heads, right? And that's what's important about this, because the counterintuitive idea is that there's only few people who actually walk with their Creator. And so popularity is deceptive. Few find the narrow gate. Christians must be willing to reject the popular ways of the world. Okay? Many, that's where I get this whole concept of popularity, because Jesus uses the words few and many, right? Many would be the more populous. Many will walk the broad way because it is easily found and it's comfortably traveled for the most part. I mean, that's where comfort is. We talk about comfort in numbers. Even people who go out to commit crime, they feel better if they have somebody with them. You know what I'm saying? Or that kind of a thing. Well, we're kind of in this together kind of thing. And so that's where we're talking about here. The word many, of course, is relative. So I don't think Jesus is trying to say when he says few, it's like, okay, only a handful. He's simply just making a contrast between the majority and the minority. The reason I put this in here is because even in the very next chapter, look at Matthew 8 and verse 11. Jesus says, I say unto you that what? Many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So, I mean, just to use the phrase many or the phrase few, that's a relative phrase. And it doesn't really tell you any specifics. It's in relation to what? And here I think the many is in relation to Israel, because in verse 10 he said, I'm back in 8:10 by the way, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. So what you might expect from God's own nation of the Old Testament did not come to pass. Most of Israel rejected Jesus. But in contrast to that, many, a majority, were going to be non-Israel people that's going to be in the kingdom. That kind of thing. See what I'm saying? But it's still true, nonetheless, that what you learn from this passage is that the minority is going to be God's people in this world, because it is contrasted with few, right? Many and few. Not many and Israel, but many and few. And so I think that's what he's saying there. And so this is, I don't have time to get into all this, but again, it brings up the question, why would God create a creation wherein most of his creatures would perish eternally? Well, the first thing that you could say in response is because the glories are well worth it. In other words, it's well worth it for you to persevere, and you will see it was all amazingly worth it. But we don't have that perspective today as far as seeing how all of that works, but we trust God. He knows what he's doing. And anyway, that's where I was going with that. And so there's a few other verses there that I have that have the word many. But in Revelation 7, 9, and 10, as I have there at the last of that subpoint, that says there was a great multitude that no one could number, and they were praising the Lamb with their robes made white in the blood of the Lamb and stuff like that. So I'm just kind of giving us some perspective on how to understand this. But the point nonetheless is, as it says there at letter C, the point, it is easier. It is easier and it is more comfortable in this world to walk according to popular opinion. And so here I get into, I think, a little bit of some modern application. Under that it says, there are many people, there's the word many, there are many, I believe, who immediately recognize many of the absurdities and the evil of popular narratives today in our culture, but most are not going to speak up. It doesn't take a genius to realize the absurdities that are asserted by the transgender movement and some of these. I know these are easy targets to put up, but I mean, they're popular and they're pervasive, so I'm going to use them. And they affect people in real life. They would affect your daughter if she plays sports, or if she has to undress in front of a male, in the locker room, these kinds of things. Or your children or grandchildren, if they go under the knife at the hospital in order to mutilate their bodies. I mean, these are real things, aren't they? But they're based on these absurdities. And my point here is that I guarantee there are so many people who know that, who know how stupid and ridiculous it is, but what are they going to do? They do not say anything. That's wrong. That's evil. Because it's easier to just say nothing and keep the peace. Or they are deceived by the voices that say, what, are you intolerant? Are you bigoted? When really, what's the loving thing to do? Uphold the truth. In love, obviously, but uphold the truth. Nothing is more loving than upholding the truth in love. And so this is I think a popular, or not a popular, but a powerful illustration of how this comes to play in our lives even today. Most will not speak up or contradict popular opinion for fear of controversy or for fear of persecution, being called a bigot or losing their jobs or whatever the case may be. But as I say here, God's people must not bend to the popular voices and the popular trends of this world. I want us to look at this passage, Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 7, because I think Jesus elaborates on this very point that I'm making here. So here Jesus is preaching about his cousin, John the Baptizer, who was in prison, and yet here Jesus is praising John's faithfulness. Look at verse 7 in Matthew 11. It says, as they departed, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? So many of these people had gone out to the Jordan River where John was preaching and baptizing. You remember back during his ministry. And Jesus was going, what did you think he was going to find out there? Of course, they heard there's a prophet out there in the wilderness and he's preaching. And so Jesus goes, did you think that you was going to see a reed? You know what a reed is? It's a plant that grows up by the Jordan, but it just the wind blows it everywhere. And he's saying, do you think, is that what you perhaps thought you might see out there? And his point is, John was far from that. He had a strong backbone. He was not going to bend to the wind of opinion. Did you go out to see a reed shaken by the wind? Verse 8. But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? In other words, somebody who was cultured and somebody who was always observed the etiquette, the politically correct etiquette of the day. That's not John, what is it? He was dressed in camel's hair, and he had austere existence and diet and things like that. He said, no, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. So that's what the kings of the world do. It's a pretty good lesson there about the powers that be who act in harmony with the world. Verse 9, what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, he was a prophet. He was more than a prophet. This is he whom it is written, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way before you. So John's like the trailblazer of this narrow way, so to speak, so that Jesus can come into the world and do his ministry. And then he gives him that great praise in verse 11. I say, among those born of women, there is not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So he's opening the doors there to the kingdom again and just saying, John is the trailblazer, and he suffered much, and he is suffering much for his work, but it's for your benefit too, so that you can come into the kingdom as well and enjoy the full benefits of forgiveness and the blood of the Messiah and the hope and all of that. And so, but you see, of course, the characteristic of John. He was not somebody who was going to take the wide and narrow way. He was going to be strong for the truth. And we need this. It's necessary. Later on, he kind of gives now some insight into the attitude of the world. Look at verse 16. We're back still in Matthew 11:16 here. What shall I liken this generation to? So he's going to give this little simile. He says, well, it's like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to their companions and saying, we played the flute for you and you did not dance. We mourned to you and you did not lament. In other words, these are people who are never satisfied, and they're always trying to make you march to the beat of their drum. I mixed metaphors, didn't I? Jesus is saying, sing to the tone of their flute, right? But it's the same thing. And so the world will want to lead you this way and that way. Satan would, the prince of the power of the air. And he's saying that's the kind of world that you live in. And so even if you try to walk this way of the world, they will have you going across the path over here and then back across the path over here and all that. You will be in a dizzying state of self-contradiction at all times. Is that not what's being said? Do you want to sing or do you want to mourn? Well, they want you to do it at the same time. Because that is the self-contradiction of sin and the direction of the world. Is that any kind of life? Is that any kind of existence? I know there are passages that talk about there are temporary pleasures of life. The lust of the flesh that can be satisfied temporarily, but is it ever fully sufficient to make you happy and to give you an abundant life? No, the saddest thing is those who actually have joy and physical pleasures for so long in life, because it deceives, doesn't it? It makes them think this is life, and at the end, it's just. Wasn't there a popular actor that just perished? And from what I understand, it was just a life of addiction and difficulty and destruction, and it's sad. It's terrible. But here's a person who had much money and I'm just trying to say that you see this on a daily basis. And yet it takes a determination on the part of the Christian to say, that's what this means when it says that we must fight the good fight of faith. The Christian life is not supposed to be a life of living in the lap of luxury and no concerns and no cares and seeing how much comfort you can have. It's about spiritual growth and taking opportunities as God gives them to you and walking this, what's called the narrow way. So he finishes this simile by applying it to John and himself. So he says, do they want us to mourn or do they want us to sing? Well, it doesn't matter what you end up doing. They're still not going to be done with you. They're still not going to be pleased. They're still going to demand more from you. Verse 18 says, John came neither eating nor drinking. They say, well, there's a demoniac. There's a nut job out in the wilderness, right? So they're going to call him names and derision, pejorative. And he says, but I have come eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So again, it doesn't matter, if you dance to the beat of their drum, it's not going to be enough. And whenever a change in the wind comes, you're expected to go with that change of the wind. But he says at the end, the lesson is wisdom is justified by her fruit, or by her, I don't know what your translation says. Mine says children. That's probably not the best one. But the idea is that kind of wisdom shows itself, its quality, by what it breeds. And it breeds self-contradiction and unhappiness and constant anger. And that is a really apt summary of our culture in high places today. Always stoking anger and discontentment. But Jesus is saying, okay, that's the broad way that many people take. But you've got to be different if you want to walk this path of life. So the last 2 points I have are persistence and what I've called predestination. What I mean by predestination is the destination that was determined before God created it. He determined the destination of these two paths, and the destination is one ends in life and the other ends in death. And since we only have no more minutes, I'm not going to be able to get into those two, and I think I'll be able to elaborate on them to some help next time. That way we don't have to pass over what I think are some good thoughts that aren't even really on your notes, but we'll elaborate on them next time. Thank you guys so much for your attention. I'm sorry I didn't open it up for more comments, but I got to rambling on. It's like my mouth falling down the stairs. You can't stop. But we will dismiss class there and pick up there next time. Thank you guys so much. Yeah, it was brought to my attention. The pagination was wrong last week. I had page 8 at the top last week as well. Now, I have printed last week's with page 7 at the top. I didn't know that anybody cared except for Haley. But she was pretty upset with me, I could tell. Yes, that should say page 7 at the top. The persistence in prayer one should say page 7, but some of you have page 8 at the top. That was my fault. Yeah. Somebody who couldn't think straight. Yeah.